Okay, well, let's go ahead and look at getting things started. So, hello everyone, thank you for coming out. Today we're going to be covering Rebuilding Rails, Chapter 3 by Noah Gibbs. And this chapter is about Rails automatic loading. So, it starts out by mentioning if you use Rails, you're probably used to not having to restart everything all the time because that gets kind of tedious, doesn't it? So, the book goes into how exactly Rails handles a lot of this loading, how it looks at, say, reloading constants, new controllers, where exactly is all that magic happening? And there's a lot of interesting stuff here that we can take a look at. This is why that's useful. Okay, that helps a lot more. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay, so back to const missing real quick, since we didn't quite get that. So let's comment that out. Do that, and then rerun that. Editor's trying to be clever again. Okay. So, to explain what exactly is happening with constant missing, if we happen to have an integer, like let's say 1, and we call that, what's going to happen is we're going to have 1.doesNotExist over here. So what this is typically going to do is, well, let's take a look back over here. Ruby integer. Oh, right. Fun fact, if you do not have the modern version of the documentation, just take off the dash version number over here. Boom, and then we have 312. Okay, so you'll notice that integer has a parent of numeric, numeric object, object, basic object. Okay, so we have all that. So what happens is whenever it hits 1.doesNotExist, and this is relevant because we're going to get back into it with some of the constants here, is that we have does integer know about does not exist? No. Then we go to this. Oops. This. Bad at that. Okay, copy those. Lazy. Okay. So what happens in the case of method missing is it'll say, does integer know about this? No. Then go up to the parent. Does numeric know about this? No. Okay. Go up to object. Does it know about it? No. Basic object, which is kind of the parent of all Ruby objects. Does that happen to know about it? No. Okay. Well, let's restart real quick then. And then go back up to integer and start the method missing chain. Does integer implement method missing? No. And then the same thing will happen. So this is essentially what's happening whenever you're looking at the entire method missing chain, is that it's going to go straight down to the parent and say, okay, we can't find that method. Great. Does anything happen to implement the method missing method? No. Okay, then keep on going up until you find it. So you end up with 2 traversals here to try and find that. And if nothing finds it, it throws its hands up and says, okay, I guess we need to throw an error. So let's say that we happen to do class numeric. Okay, let's see if I remember the exact syntax for method missing real quick. Method missing Ruby. Let's see what you have here. Method missing, method args block. Gotcha. Okay. So this is what I mean, is that method missing is going to be hit here, and if it happens to hit a method name called does not exist, it's going to intercept that and do something else with it. This is very useful because sometimes you want to hook into this behavior to say, if this doesn't exist, I want to do something with it. And the entire concept of Rails is this, except we want to do it with a constant. So let's backspace this real quick. So Ruby's naming scheme tends to be something and then some action. So if you take a look at method missing here, and you say, well, method, great. Could that be something like const? Yes. Could that be module? Also yes. So then you start noticing this pattern of the suffix is going to keep on repeating itself. So that ends up being very useful. And the one we're focusing on today happens to be const missing, which is constant missing. And that's how Rails uses a lot of this stuff. So what we were doing over here with this const missing example is if the constant is missing, we will instead warn about that constant instead of doing something. So let's take this out real quick and do super, which will do the exact same thing. So in that case, it'll say we hit const missing uninitialized constant, because that's going to go up to the normal way this handles. If we have to comment that out and then get back to the warn, then instead we're going to get, oops, don't want to bring that over, missing constant Bobo over here. So on inspect, and the reason that I was mentioning this earlier is inspect tells you what the actual Ruby thing is here. If we happen to take that off, this entire thing right here implicitly calls toString. So if we run that again, notice the colon's not there anymore. And that's because C has effectively toString called right here, which may not give you the information you need, because if you got that, how do you know it's a symbol? How do you know that's what's going on? Well, you wouldn't, and that'd be a little bit more complicated to debug. So what we're doing right here in this case is that we know explicitly we want to use the Bobo class over here, which has this one method. So if we're missing the constant, we're going to explicitly load this and then explicitly return that constant. So it's kind of like, I missed the constant, great, require this file where I know it's at, and then return back the constant that's going to come out of that file. And this is a very explicit manual one-shot type of thing. So if we happen to run that again, okay, so comment that out. Okay, so that gets back the constant and then calls through to this method over here. So that's kind of what we're aiming for. Oops. Readjust microphone. Okay. Now we're good. Okay, so that should be a quick catch up to where we are. Now then. So back to where we were, and again, thanks, Julie, I did not notice that. Camel case versus snake case. If we happen to get const missing with bad apple controller over here, how exactly would we turn that into a file name? Because we just put .rb on that. It's Fleet Week in case you hear any planes in the background. Very pesky. Anyway, if you just directly put .rb on the end of that, that wouldn't give you anything useful. That would just give you camel case. And that would be the case of, say, So that's not going to get what you want. Instead, what we want is something more along the lines of bad apple controller, which is snake case. So for those of you not familiar with the exact nomenclature here, camel case typically means, and this is capitalized camel case, the way you delimit words is by capitalization. Snake case, the way you delimit this is by underscores. Kebab case, instead of underscores, it'd be dashes, and that's common in CSS. But we only really care about snake case right now. So the question is, how exactly are we going to get that? Because that seems like a slightly complicated transformation to do. Which, if you're thinking that, congratulations, you're right, which is why we're allowed to be lazy and just grab this stuff from Active Record. So let's go over to rulers, util, make the util file. Okay, paste this over, indent this. And I will explain vaguely what the regex does, but this is going to be a little bit involved. So do bear with me there. And I prefer leading dot instead of trailing dot. Okay. So let's see how exactly we want to explain this. So the first thing is colons. Like, let's say you've seen, let's use this as an example. Net HTTP. So if you want to turn that directly into what we need for the require, you might notice that it's net/HTTP. So the first step of this is take that colon and make that into slashes. So that would mean this becomes this. Okay. And then we have a capture group here, which is to say the capitalized letters A to Z, where there are one or more of those, and then a capital letter A to Z plus any number of lowercase letters. What we're going to do is substitute that with first group underscore second group. So the reason why they're doing this, which is saying one or more of these, is because you have fully capitalized things like HTTP here, which make that a little bit more difficult. So what this would do is take this and put that over to that. Actually, tell you what, let's cheat a little bit. One of the reasons I really like tap is because you can put it at various places around here. Okay, let's take the entirety of that string. Oops. Man, I made a mess out of that. Okay. Okay, so take all those. Actually, let's get rid of these comments real quick. I don't need those for now. Then go back to these taps. So for those of you who are not familiar with tap will return whatever the result beforehand was. So it doesn't do anything. Think of it as tapping into something and being able to play with it, but not actually doing anything. After this, the close, okay. Let's instead take this method. We'll take off self just for a moment so we can put this in IRB real quick. point. So we will do a little something about this. Okay. Add HTTP. Oh, right. You know, it helps if I put puts in there. So let's take these real quick and make that into singles. And then we'll take the taps over here. Okay, now we can actually use that. So that one didn't give us much of anything useful. Let's say that we happen to have that instead. So that gives us something a little bit more useful. The first step is going to put the slashes in there. The second step, I do not remember what exactly that was doing. Third step is going to divide all of those with underscore and then a capital letter. Fourth step, replace any dashes with underscores, and then last step, downcase it. Anyway, that's a little bit involved. So one trick I like using is having a flag over here. So if you want to see what it's doing, you can turn debug false to debug true. So we'll go ahead and take all of these. If debug. So that's a little bit more involved, but that gives us what we're looking for. Then of course that's not quite giving us what we want, so pesky quotes. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much. That will give us what we're looking for. Yep, and as the book mentions, this comes directly over from Rails, so we can just copy that. Okay, so into reloading. So the first thing is, you might have noticed in the first session, I happen to do path rulers here. Well, it turns out that it's actually a chapter 3 item, but that's an old habit that I have. Okay, so we don't need to worry too much about this. Now then, rulers lib, rulers dependencies. Dependencies, okay, let's also make sure. That's not going to automatically load that. Util dependencies. Const missing C. Rulers to underscore C. Okay. So we got that. We have all those in there. So this underscores it into what we need there. And then const get is a little bit more interesting. I think it'll pop up the documentation if I give it that. Okay, so check if a constant is available in a module. In this case, it's checking if object happens to have a constant defined as that. And if you have a require file, you're going to find an object. so we go over to Best Quotes Applications. We have the load path there. We can go back over here. And then we can take out the quotes controller here, because quotes controller should be where we can get at that. Load that up. Then quotes / a quote. Okay, so that's exactly what we expect over here, which is the quote and then all the rack debugging information. So if we go back over to quotes controller here, let's say that we do not need this anymore. Let's leave it there. Anyway. I think that is all this chapter had. So if you really want to get deep on how requirements are loading and everything else like that, there is Zitework now, which does a lot of that. And there was the opening keynote of RailsConf 2022, and I'll post a link to this a little bit later, but that's what you're going to want to look at if you want to know how Rails is currently doing this and Rails is currently loading all these things, because that enables a lot of the hot reloading. This is how it's using a lot of this stuff, which Xavier will go into a lot more detail about it, but essentially using autoload. Okay. So let's see if we have anything else here. But before we get into that, do we have any questions or anything that people are curious about with const get, const missing, or any of those things? Okay, if not, we might be able to look at a few of the examples here. I might leave those ones as an exercise because they're a little bit more involved this time around. But I will answer some of those questions back over the channel and we can go from there. I think that's all I have for today, unless anyone else has any questions, anything they're curious about, and we can dig into those. Otherwise, we can call it a day. Yep, and just a quick reference on tap. So you might think this is going to return 2. It's still going to return 1. You could put puts in here to do that. Tap is more of a debugging method that doesn't actually do anything to the object unless you happen to mutate it, in which case I would suggest you probably not use tap because it's getting confusing. But if you really want to modify something like that, you could use then, which is kind of the opposite, which is I do take something, I put the value directly in there, I pipe it through this, and then allow people to do what they want with it. Then it's also very useful. But tap, extremely useful whenever you want to kind of, so to speak, tap into something and see what exactly it's doing each step of this. Okay, well, that all said, we will go ahead and call it a day for now. I'll probably trim out some of the screen section where we didn't get stuff, and we can go from there. We will circle back for Chapter 4 next week, and I'll be sure to get some of the events and everything else going a little bit earlier this time around. Well, thanks so much for coming out, and have a great rest of your week.